the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, war rages as the Great Extermination spreads, a race against time and a gateway to the unknown, and a hero stands against the coming darkness. Plus, we continue our ongoing audiobook serialization of Timothy Zahn's Cobra, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I am Baen Associate Editor and your podcast host, David Afsharirad. Today we bring you part one in a two-part interview Patrick Hazlett conducted with Larry Correia about the new Saga of the Forgotten Warrior entry, Tower of Silence. But first, the news. The April hardcovers and trade paperbacks are in. First up is Tower of Silence by Larry Correia. The assassination of the chief judge has pushed the capital to the edge. The Great Extermination has spread to all the land. The casteless must be annihilated. Their only hope is the fallen Protector Ashok Vadal, but Vadal is being held prisoner on the island of Fortress. In order to save those who need him most, he must escape and find his way across the demon-infested sea and return to Thera, the prophet of an illegal and forgotten god. Ashok Vadal, Thera, and the Sons of the Black Sword face foes both human and supernatural, Byzantine political intrigue, and bloody hand-to-hand combat, and gods and demons alike. But Vadal is a warrior with a warrior's heart, and woe to those who would stand in his way, man, god, demon, or otherwise. Next up is Escape Orbit by Patrick Hazlett. 5 years ago, astronaut Jack Templeton took the spacecraft Magellan to the farthest reaches of our solar system, never to be heard from again. Until now, when the Magellan suddenly reappears where an undiscovered planet was supposed to be, it poses more questions than answers. In a race against time, Jack's former crewmate Tracy Keane spearheads a desperate effort to outfit a rescue mission. But she has competition. Agencies of both American and foreign governments have their own agendas, and saving rogue astronauts isn't among them. And at the edge of all that is known, a gateway to the unknown awaits. And finally, Wraithbound by Tim Akers. Since he was a boy, Ray has dreamed of being a stormbinder like his father, with an air elemental stitched into the fabric of his soul and the winds of heaven at his command. Those dreams died when his father, through no fault of his own, fell into disgrace and was banned by the Justicars of the Iron Council. The family fled to the edge of the ordered world to live in fear in the shadow of encroaching chaos. When Ray defies his father's orders and attempts to stitch an air elemental to his soul, he instead binds himself to a mysterious wraith. That's when things get complicated and the world starts to fall apart around him. Literally. That's Tower of Silence by Larry Correia, Escape Orbit by Patrick Hazlett, and Wraithbound by Tim Akers, all available now. And that's it for the news.
Welcome. We are here with the Baen Radio Free podcast. I am here with Larry Correia. Larry, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing awesome, Sean. Glad to be on again.
Yeah, I'm. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. And you have the Tower of Silence. I think it's out like today, right?
Yeah, today's the release date. It's April 4th, and pretty excited about that. It's out in hardcover and ebook, and audio is coming, but I don't have the date on that audio yet. That's delayed.
Okay, and then for those who are watching this, it's probably 3 days prior, but pretty close enough. So, tell us where at the very beginning of the book we leave off with Ashok from the prior version.
Oh man. Okay, so we're finished. Some spoilers are going to be involved here. Obviously, we're talking about book 4 of a 5-book series. We left the main character Ashok had just fought his best friend of his entire life in a duel that was really good. Came out in an interesting way. He winds up on the island of Fortress, which is far to the south. It's the forbidden secret southern island where the religious fanatics supposedly live. They don't know anything about these people. Just that's where gunpowder comes from. And so we open up with Ashok in prison, where he's been imprisoned for the last, I believe, most of a year, basically chained to a wall, starving. And that's where we open. And as he's finally put on trial for his crimes of being a evil outside trespasser on this place. But also because this is it's kind of like the fortress is the opposite of Locke of the mainland, because the mainland basically they have the all-encompassing law that banned religion and took the place of religion. Basically, the god is the law, whereas Fortress was where the religion is kind of like Taiwan to China, only religion, not communism. And so basically they wound up in Fortress, but they've also kind of fallen in unbelief, but in different ways, because they had to prophesize things that were supposed to happen have not happened. And their ruling class has become more and more awful. And Ashok comes along, and it appears that he actually fulfills these various prophecies, and but just not in the way that they wanted. And then Ashok goes about doing Ashok things as he does. For those of you that haven't read the series, the way I described this character, because he opens up when the book one starts, he is not a good dude. He is the ultimate law enforcer. He's basically fantasy Judge Dredd. He is the dude that burns villages as part of it. He just does awful things. He's a paladin, but it's not a lawful good paladin. It's a lawful paladin, right? And as the story goes on, he learns the truth of his world, and he evolves as a person, and he actually grows and just has to make his own code of right and wrong. So he winds up in this place that's been basically abusing all this stuff that he's been learning about, and he doesn't take it well. and you gotta say, Ashok is probably one of the most violent characters I've ever written, just by default. This guy he's a superhuman killing machine by design, and he puts that to good use in rather exciting ways.
Yeah, there's a scene, and it won't give anything away, where I think he's passing into a town, I'll just call it a town or a city, with some monks. And somebody kind of looks at him, it's kind of like, what are you looking at? And he kind of he thinks there's an unbelievable level of restraint there, because he thinks a dead man. And he's still able to restrain himself. So he is growing in some ways. Can you say a little bit more, not about that incident, but about his character arc over this series? And by the way, explain what caste he's from, because there's the caste system.
Yeah, so and actually that's how the whole kind of pseudo-Indian setting came about originally, is because when I came up with the idea is I needed a world with a really rigid caste system. And the way it's broken down in this universe is there's basically four levels of people. Well, three levels of people. And the first being the ruling caste, or referred to as the first caste. They are the administrators. Because keep in mind, the law is basically taking the place of religion. The law is the all-encompassing, all-controlling central authority. The law needs administrators. It needs judges. It needs people to arbitrate it, and basically the lawyer class. And so that's your ruling class. They're the highest. And then to serve them and or to protect them is the warrior caste, the second caste. And the warriors are basically the military, because the way the country is divided up, there's 12 great houses that each are kind of like a familial lineage kind of thing going on. They're competing, but they're all united under one central authority, the law, the capital. The warrior caste is the armies of each of these. And actually the law allows for a certain amount of war between these different, because they look at it as competition as a good thing. And so they want the warrior caste to be occupied. The warrior caste needs to be fighting the other warrior caste, not looking with jealousy towards the ruling class.
That sounds familiar.
I know. Yeah, I don't know. There's some themes in this book.
Yeah, there are some themes. We'll talk about themes later, but yeah. Go on. Sorry.
Well, I focus on the entertainment aspects, but there's a lot of world building in this. Then the third caste is the workers. The workers are basically the labor caste. They're the people who do all the miscellaneous things to serve. Now they're kind of screwed because they're very limited on what they're allowed to do, but they're also super vital because without them, you starve. They're the guys that make everything run on time. And I get into the book a little bit. This is the only universe, and I never write about this in the book, but I'm a former finance guy. I have a fantasy world with fractional reserve banking in it, but I never talk about that because that'd be super boring to the reader. But the worker caste actually manages the trade and the money, is what it is, and that's why they're important. Then the fourth is not actually a caste; they're the casteless.
They're not actually people.
Yeah,
Right.
legally they're not people. Legally it goes humans, or first caste, second caste, third caste. That's humans. Livestock, the casteless. and so basically they're the non-people, and a big part of the book is where they come from, like really where these people come from and why they exist. And they're kind of regulated to just the worst roles in society that no one else wants. They get the roles that are basically the dregs. They are the ones that clean the sewer. In this universe, the ocean is cursed. Basically, they're on land, they're surrounded by ocean, they're surrounded by sea. The sea is basically hell in this universe. It's populated by a horrible race that they're called demons. That's what the people think of them as demons. Mm-hmm. They're actually unstoppable, horrific killing machines. So guess who gets to live by the ocean? The casteless, the lowest of the low. And but that also makes them, so they do have a purpose in the society, and they do serve a role, and which is why they haven't got rid of them. However, when the book opens, there is actually a scheme afoot to get rid of the casteless. That's where this comes from. And that's a big part of the background of the story. And Ashok finds out the truth of this world and why things are the way they really are.
But even in your economic system, the casteless provide a function, right? They're not entirely useless to such an extent that their disappearance could cause great upheaval, potentially.
Unbelievable upheaval in a lot of ways, because you think about it, if society is like, well, every dishonorable thing that has to happen, we're just going to, well, we don't want to talk about it. We're going to have those guys do it. And keep in mind, this is a world where water is looked down upon, anything related to water. And also when you have a land crisscrossed by rivers, who gets to deal with that? And all the river traffic is also the casteless. And so, yeah, once again, this is not an economics book, guys. This is an action adventure sword and sorcery kind of book, but I put a lot of thought in this stuff. Ashok comes from the highest caste. He's actually a member of a special militant order called the Protectors. So they're basically an organization with a capital that is like the central bureau of ultimate law enforcement officers. And every one of these guys has been magically augmented to be better than a regular warrior. And so they're drawn from the first caste or the warrior caste, usually the highest of the high families, and those donate their kids to this order, where they serve a term of enlistment of 10 or 20 years. They go around basically doing the unspeakable on behalf of the law. And they are judge, jury, and executioner, roving magical law enforcement agents. And this is a rather merciless system that we built here. So our main character comes from that background, and he is the Protector's protector. He is the man. Like, he is the one that all the other protectors talk about. Like holy crap, it's that guy. And we get into where he comes from, and you actually learn why he is the living embodiment of the law. Because other people, they have like consciences that trouble them, as they're doing things.
He's like the algorithm there's an algorithm operating in his head. It's either the law or not the law. Whether it's good or bad is not. It's either law yes, law no, and the law no gets absolutely punished.
Yeah, it's actually my cover blurb is from Jim Butcher on one of the books, and because Jim loved it, and Jim thought it was the best take ever on that whole concept of the paladin character who was a law first, and because a lot of times that's written as lawful stupid. They just do it dumbly because it's required and doesn't really make a lot of sense. Ashok, when you get to know why he is the way he is, it makes perfect sense. He's not just a person; he's a creation. He was built from the ground up to be the ultimate servant of the law. And I take that from him. Basically, we ruin his world. We turn it upside down. And as the series goes on, he is forced to become a lawbreaker. And believe me, this guy would love to just walk into the ocean and end it all at that point, but he can't, because once he is commanded to do something, he has to do it to the best of his ability. There is no quit, there is no stop. So he's just kind of an unstoppable force of a character. But as the series goes on, it's great because I get to actually develop him as he actually meets people outside of his sphere, and he learns about the rest of the world. As the series goes on, it's basically I describe Ashok as a cross between like the Punisher and George Washington.
I can see that. I can definitely see that. And the interesting part about it is he's starting to learn as he leaves Locke and is in, walking around or kind of interacting with the monks as an example. He starts to learn different things about the world that have been hidden from his worldview or he's not been exposed to, in terms of how the world came to be what it was, et cetera. I'm not going to say too much about that here, but it starts to kind of mess with his worldview. How do you see him developing through this process, even this book and beyond?
Yeah, well, so originally when I pitched this to Tony Weisskopf, I pitched it as a trilogy. And
The Baen
Tony,
5-book trilogy?
Well, yeah, here's the kicker. There's Tony's smart. She's smarter than I am. She's way more experienced. I gave her some of the black stories. She loved it. She bought it. She was all in. It's a great story. She's like, okay, what is your outline for the rest of the series? I gave her my outline. I'm an outliner. She knows that. So I gave her my outline. This is what's going to happen. And she came back to me. She says, that is not 3 books. She's like, that's 5 books. And I was like, oh, no. I could fit it in 3. I've done it before. I did Hard Magic. It's a trilogy. I can do a trilogy. And she's like, okay, I'll give you a contract for 3 books. Let's see how you do. And then I wrote House of Assassins, which actually turned out to be the first half of the second book in my outline. And it's a full book. It's a full-size novel. So I was like, okay, geez. So I went back to Tony. I was like, I was wrong, Tony. You were correct. And so that's how it's worked out. But so I've plotted this out from the very beginning. Kind of, Ashok's the main character. And so we see his arc, we see his journey over this. He goes from basically unfeeling automaton of the law to an actual human being, with all that entails and the passions that entails and what that means, and who finds a new thing to fight for. And when you take somebody that dangerous who's fighting for something before, the guy is actually, he's a terrible leader. He is actually, as a symbol, he's incredible. As a leader, he's awful, because he doesn't understand regular people. I've actually got a lot of fans who have various I'm trying to think with verbal emotional disconnects, and they email me. He's like, dude, I love Ashok. Ashok is the best fit I've ever had for a character. I was like, well, thank you. But I also write there's a bunch of other characters we follow too. So I bring in characters from every caste, so we can kind of see their perspective on things, and we kind of bring them along on this adventure. It's actually really interesting. So everybody's got an arc, and basically I'm writing about when this book is basically the end of the age of law. And this is the age of law that they've had for the last, 1,000 years almost. And this is the new thing. Basically, what I'm writing here is the beginning of the revolution to the next stage of this culture's existence, is what it is. So it's kind of like the time of turmoil. And but Ashok is not that I'm a symbolism writer. I'm not a big symbolism guy, but Ashok kind of is symbolic of his whole people, because it was the unfeeling law having to step into the next thing. So honestly, I love this series. I'm primarily known as an action adventure guy, and I stick a lot of action adventure in this. But this series is the one that I actually get to put like my big boy pants on, and I really kind of stretch and go for like some deeper stuff. I'm really proud of this one. I enjoy the hell out of it. I'm excited to finish it. I want to get the whole series out there for everybody to see, because it's got a cool ending. It's a cool series.
Now, what about the man who almost killed Ashok. The kind of the reason he is in kind of the South and imprisoned, because he was. It sounds like he was left for dead for the most part.
Yep.
Kind of the so-called puppet king. let's say. That's an interesting character. Why don't we
I
talk
love
a little bit more
Devidos. Yeah, Devidos is a great character. So Devidos is also a protector like Ashok. Difference being that, and they were like brothers. They came up together. He's a couple years older than Ashok, but Ashok was like Mr. Super Overachiever, so obviously he was, in a level above. But Devidos is considered the best of the best, and he's always had this thing. And so he comes from a super important lineage, but he was robbed of it as a boy. Like, he never had a chance to be what he should have been. His dad was the ruler of a great house. His dad was the bearer of an ancestor blade, which we haven't talked about, but in the series is a big deal. And his dad failed and died. And then his kingdom, his house, was crushed and then dismantled into 2 other houses. So Devidos gets sent off to the Protectors as a boy, robbed of everything he should have been. This is like the man who should have been great. Instead, he's regulated to this organization of law enforcers. That said, he can't help but be that guy that is the best. And that's how he's wired. So when you hook him up with somebody like Ashok, they're a perfect combination of 2 dudes who will never, ever stop. And as the series goes on, they wind up at opposite ends of this battle. So it's like these guys were brothers. That said, Devidos, Ashok is flawed in a lot of ways, but Ashok is Ashok. Devidos is flawed too, in that his ambition and his pride. He's not a bad man per se, but he's easily roped into being bad if it goes along with his goals and his pride and just the man can't bear to not achieve. And so when you put him against Ashok, it's like these 2 unstoppable forces colliding. But the thing is, they're actually genuinely best friends. They're brothers who have to then, at the end of book 3, Destroyer of Worlds, these 2 guys have to fight to the death. They have to duel to the death, because Ashok is everything that Devidos wanted to be but couldn't be. And so that Devidos, and the thing is, they're both lawbreakers, even though one is the champion of the law and the other is like now this horrible outsider, like the traitor, the great traitor of this whole society. Only really, honestly,
which is ironic because he's like the embodiment of the law, right?
So Ashok's actually the one that's more truthful, even though he's the criminal, the wanted criminal. He's the one that's actually devoted, whereas Devidos will pay lip service to the law to get what he wants. And so there's a conspiracy going on to basically overthrow the government and install Devidos as the puppet king. Only Devidos is nobody's puppet. And so the conspirators, who, they're bad dudes too, especially one in particular, who we get into a lot in the last book. They've wanted to install this guy as their puppet because he's like the perfect symbolic dude. He's the hero. And I get a lot into this book about the propaganda and how they like twist reality. And I have this one guy who's a master manipulator of public sentiment. They put on plays about the events of the book, and and you can see the play and how it's just like this horribly untrue version of what actually happened. But it's all emotional manipulation. He's out there paying graffiti artists to like do graffiti of propaganda. Even though it's illegal to like write on a government building, he's like, go do graffiti to show Devidos as like this heroic figure who's standing up to scary, evil Ashok. That way the people, the masses, the worker caste will look at that and be like, oh yeah, that's the sentiment. It's just, I love that guy. So yeah, he's part of a conspiracy to overthrow the government, even as he is like the representative of it. And as we left off in book 4, that is going on. I mean, we're actively having basically at this point as where we're at right now, and a lot of people don't even know it.
What I really appreciate about it is it's a good frame of how systems and governments actually work in the sense that, I'm not saying any specific governments, but you have these effete elites kind of in the background making these decisions, but the decisions are very broad, with very broad strokes. And even the way that the slow wheel of execution turns, I think you do a phenomenal job of explaining how that is when you put something out that people know is kind of not just logically but intuitively is the wrong thing and is like a super bad idea. There's some people who are just like, yes sir, right away sir, and they just do it, but there's a huge resistance that declines at like almost inversely correlated or directly correlated with distance, right?
Yep.
Where people are reluctant to do insane things, but yet people still do it. So exactly what decision I'm talking about.
It's interesting to me because, like, a fantasy novel, too many times where I see where people write a fantasy novel and they'll have the evil overlord will just give his orders and then his armies of orcs will just go do whatever. I mean, that works if you're writing a populace that's just kind of like unthinking creations, but that's not how humans work. And I'm writing about humans. I'm writing about people. But people can be manipulated emotionally, and they can be, even the best of intentions can be twisted, and people can be lied to. And so honestly, a big part of this book is, I mean, I kind of love getting into the political machinations of it, but I hate when you have bad guys who are just like mustache twirling evil for the sake of evil. I mean, but basically in this book, I have one guy who is literally the embodiment of freaking evil. But however, he has his motivations. There's a reason he is doing what he is doing. And if you look at it from his perspective, it actually makes perfect sense. He's a complete sociopath. But it makes perfect sense for him. And I got all these different great houses. Each one of them is in it to win it for them. And I've got the judges, the administrators of the law. They are trying to do what they can for their own power. And so it's just like real life. You got these different groups of people who are all kind of vying for what they want and what they think is best. And then a lot of regular people just kind of get scooped up in this and squished.
It's almost like real life in the sense that people follow their interests. And when they say or do things that don't make sense at face value, if you follow or put yourself into their position and try to understand what their interests are. Like, again, I don't want to stray too far outside the book, but when you look at Putin, for example, if you look at his perspective, you can see what his interests are and you can predict what he's going to do. And I appreciate the way in your book that you do that, but it still has the friction of reality, the friction of war, the friction of execution on some of these things. And I don't know if this is the first time you revealed it, so I'm afraid to say it. It begins with 8. It rhymes with 8 and determination. 8 determination.
Oh, the Great Extermination?
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay. I was like, let me say, because I talked about that earlier in the series, so we're good.
Okay. Yeah, that is this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like that's fascinating watching the wheels of execution turn on that. Say a little bit more about why.
Well, because what it is, the casteless. So I'll have some spoilers here, but I do reveal this in the first book. The reason the casteless are casteless, the reason you have this group of human beings that are just considered, they can't hold any office in society whatsoever. They're just property. It's because in the olden days, before the rise of the age of law, they were the boss. They were the people in charge. And I don't go to get into history too much, but basically there was one of the tropes I love in fantasy novels is that there was the chosen one would be born, like, so the bad guy, the big evil bad guy attacks 1,000 years ago or whatever, and then somebody defeats him, and then a descendant of that hero in 1,000 years is the only one that can defeat the big bad again, right? We've all seen that trope a million times. And then when you see the novel, it's assistant pig farmer's son is the chosen one who has to become the great hero. Luke
That's
Skywalker,
a Pride.
whatever.
That's Pride series. You pulled right out of the Pride and Assistant Pig
Yeah,
Keeper, right?
yeah. So you know what I mean? It's been done a million times in fantasy.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, genetically, that's not how human beings work. If you had a great hero 1,000 years ago who had all these generations of kids to get to this kid, you don't have one descendant, you have 10,000 descendants. That's how it works. And with genetic selection, a fraction of those will actually have some of your DNA in them. Okay. So what I did instead was, and they did have the big bad evil thing, the demons, the great war against the demons, where the demons rain from the sky, which we'll get into the mythology a little bit, but mankind barely survived, and mankind barely survived because of one guy, one basically super soldier who brought magic to the masses and enabled mankind to defeat the demons and drive them into the ocean, but has prophesied that someday the demons would return. And only the blood of that great hero, only the bloodline of that great hero would be able to defeat the demons. So you think about human nature. What happens when you have people who are like that important and that infallible and that you can never get rid of them, and society must cater to their needs? Well, you'd create a warrior caste to defend them. You'd create a worker caste to serve them. You'd build up a religion around them. They would have priests. They would have people about how important they are and how important it is you keep these people around. And what would those people do? They would turn awful. Over hundreds of years, they would get worse and worse and worse and more numerous and more bossy and more annoying. I was kind of like, you look at the Saudi Arabia and the House of Saud. You don't mess with the House of Saud. It's the princes, and there's 1,000 princes or whatever they've got now. This is that kind of thing on steroids. And so at the Age of Kings is what they called it, before the Age of Law, the people had just gotten so sick of their high and mighty saviors that they cast them down. However, enough people still believed in the old ways and the old beliefs that only this bloodline could save us, that they made it illegal to kill them. So they could no longer hold office. They could no longer serve in any capacity. They could no longer have jobs. They were completely outside, and let them die. But you couldn't kill them. And that's how we got the casteless. And then the Age of Law was born, and the law has now, over 1,000 years, turned into basically the same thing that it threw down so long ago, with an upper class of elites who just tell everybody else what to do. And now they're like, we have one guy involved who wants to get rid of the casteless for a very specific reason. But I probably shouldn't say on the podcast what that is, just because that is a big reveal. That's a huge reveal, and it's also an awesome scene. So basically, it's like he proposes a plan. He brings forward a plan. Well, he doesn't. His little minions do. They called the Great Extermination, and basically they originally called it the Extermination War, but that wasn't cool because you war against people. These guys are less than livestock. You don't have a war. Plus, saying war makes it sound like it'll be hard, and we want everybody to think it's going to be easy.
Right.
So it's like, hey, basically, we got to go kill millions and millions of people all across the entire continent that we are dependent upon for a lot of things. We're going to go kill them, but don't worry, it'll be easy. And then society will be better. And so the series has been going on for a few years now, but they laid the groundwork beforehand. One of the main characters is a great character. She's an archivist. She's a researcher for the capital.
Librarian.
Yeah, she's the librarian, Radha Mantha. Love this character, fantastic character, and how she gets involved in all this is she's too smart. She is not the person that the government would get to do research into a situation like this to see if it's okay to do this or not, Right. So instead they give it to an idiot to present the official report, only she kind of butts in and takes over and does her research and come into the forbidden stuff, because remember, religion is banned, and this gets into religious. And she comes out and she's like, no, this is what it is. This is why we can't kill these people. Well, at that point, she's got to go. So the conspirators like, we got to shut her up.
Yep.
And that's how she comes into this. And fantastic character, because she's just a nerd who's out of her depth. Love her.
But in the book, she actually demonstrates some qualities that someone of her caste generally doesn't, that are helpful. which is also interesting.
One of the things I try to do with all the characters too is I've got these different 4 different groups, but I try to basically bring somebody from each one who epitomizes the good of their caste. They epitomize the ideal of what their caste is and their place, and they all kind of like, they're all stuck where they are, but because of circumstances they rise above. So Radha is the representative of the first caste, who is actually a really good person and who is actually trying to do that, the nobility of actually trying to help the people below you, and she grows into that, because when she starts, she is not that at all. She's an antisocial librarian who hates all people and just wants to be left alone and to read books, but she gets dragged into this, and over time it forces her. And then the warrior is Jagdish, who is one of my all-time favorite characters I've ever written. Actually, long before this series existed, Jagdish was a character in a role-playing game, and that's where Jagdish comes from, like a long time ago.
By the way, there's a scene in that book. I don't know. I'll try not to give it away, where I love how you made it happen, because I'm trying not to reveal any. I'm not any spoilers, but something happens, and he goes out literally to kill the guy who didn't show up when he was supposed to show up, and then having been an army officer, there's something. What happens to resolve that was just classic. I'm like, yep. Yep. Of course. It's something that, just misallocation of resources, like that sort of thing. But the way that you framed it, like, I thought he was going to kill the guy. He might kill the guy. I'm not saying he didn't.
Well, because it's all the same warrior pride thing. Because warriors have to be proud. And I got a society here with based on, they have they have an honor code for dueling and resolving all your issues through violence, and basically your social status, and it's all about social status and violence and power. And so when this guy thinks that somebody who's his equal in rank screwed him in a way that it put his family in danger, it didn't just screw him like politically or no, it screwed him in a way that his house almost got burned down with his kid in it, right? So he was pissed. And so he's like he's just gonna murder this other guy. Plus Jagdish is a hell of a good duelist, right? That's part of his thing. And this dude trains hard. And so he goes to just kick ass. And then when you get to the situation, it's like, this is what actually happened. He's like, damn it. And there's this moment of warrior pride, though, where the actual warriors, the guy that actually fight and have honor, but put up with this crappy system that they're in, are both like, let's go mess with the dudes that caused this problem.
Yeah. Well, was it Gautama? Is that the other guys?
Fonto Gautama. I love that guy.
He's like 20 years older, and the way he handled it was like an elder statesman. He's just like, yeah, I thought you'd want to kill me. Just read this first, and just to understand the level of I can't say this word, but you probably know what word it begins with an R and ends in Asian. But it's just one of those things, like, hire sends something down and you're like, what the hell?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? You've got to be kidding me.
I actually really like Gautama. Yeah, he's a new character in the fourth book, and he's a great character. That guy's a hoot, because he's very much he's the old soldier, whereas Jagdish is the young hard charger, and he's the young badass who's also been put in a station far above what he should be at this point, just because of the circumstances of the third book, which is, as I've been told, is the greatest promotion ceremony ever written. Don't want to spoil it. That scene in the third book where he gets promoted is basically the equivalent in the third book is we took a guy who was a second lieutenant who won the Medal of Honor, and they made him a 5-star general. I mean, it's not. It was like, hey, this guy. Yeah, hey, guys, look, we have a new hero. We got a big deal here. Then this is, and the politician who just does it, just declares it. Well, actually, it'd be like a 1-star general, but the politician just declares it, and it is what it is. It'd be like the president of the United States just came and said, "Hey, this guy did really good, and we really need a hero right now. What's the highest thing I can put him to? General? Sure, let's do that." It's like, I don't know what the ranks are, whatever you call it.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that happens in corporate all the time, and you're like,
yeah, it was actually a very corporate decision is what happened. But poor Jagdish goes from a guy who's basically getting the court-martial to being promoted 10 ranks in like 3 minutes. And he thought he was going to get executed. Remember, there's no like dishonorable discharge here. It's like your dishonorable discharge is you get hung.
sounds about right.
And now we bring you Timothy Zahn's Cobra. Earth's only hope was the Cobras. The colony worlds Adirondack and Silvern fell to the Troft forces almost without a struggle. Outnumbered and on the defensive, Earth made a desperate decision. It would attack the aliens not from space, but on the ground, with forces the Trofts did not even suspect. Thus were created the Cobras, a guerrilla force whose weapons were surgically implanted, invisible to the unsuspecting eye, yet undeniably deadly. But power brings temptation, and not all the Cobras could be trusted to fight for Earth alone. Johnny Moreau would learn the uses and abuses of his special abilities and what it truly meant to be a Cobra.
Parked at one end of Capitalia's starfield, Darl's ship was an impressive sight. Smaller than the big space-only transports, of course, but still more than twice the size of Aventine's own Dewdrop. A sensor guard perimeter extended another 50 meters in all directions, and as Johnny passed its boundary, he noticed an automated turret atop the ship rotate slightly to cover him. The two Marines at the closed entryway made no such obvious moves, but Johnny saw that the muzzles of their shoulder-mounted Parrott guns stayed on him the entire way. "Syndic Johnny Moreau to see Comite Darl," he told him, coming to a halt a few meters away. "Are you expected, sir?" one of the guards asked. He could afford to be courteous. In full exoskeleton armor, he was more powerful than even a Cobra. "He'll see me," Johnny said. "Tell him I'm here." The other guard glanced at his partner. "The Comite's quite busy, sir, with the departure tomorrow and all." "Tell him I'm here," Johnny repeated. The first guard pursed his lips and touched a control at his throat. His conversation was brief and inaudible, but a moment later he nodded. "The Comite will see you, Syndic," he told Johnny. "Your escort will be here shortly." Johnny nodded and settled down to wait, and when the escort arrived, he wasn't surprised to see who it was. "Johnny!" Jamie nodded in greeting. His smile was cordial but tight. "Comite Darl's waiting in his office, if you'll follow me." They passed through the heavy carhelium steel entryway and between another pair of armored Marines. "I was hoping to see you again before we left," Jamie said as they started into a maze of short corridors. "Your office said you were on vacation and couldn't be reached." "Chris thought it would help me to get away for a couple of weeks," Johnny told him evenly. "Try to come to grips with what your Comite's done to us." Jamie looked sideways at him. "And did you? You mean, do I intend to attack him?" Johnny shook his head. "No. All I want is to understand him, to find out why. He owes me that much." Ahead, two more Marines, this pair in dress uniforms, flanked an obviously reinforced door. Jamie led the way between them and palmed the lock, and the panel slid soundlessly open. "Syndic Moreau," Darl said, rising from the desk that dominated the modest-sized room. "Welcome. Please sit down." He indicated a chair across the desk from him. Johnny did so. Jamie took a chair by the desk's corner, equidistant from the other two men. Johnny wondered briefly if the choice was deliberate, decided it probably was. "I'd hoped you'd come by this evening," Darl said, sitting back down himself. This will be our last chance to talk, shall we say, honestly, before the tedious departure ceremonies Zhu has scheduled for tomorrow. Tedious? I take it it's not the public acclaim or adoration that makes all this worthwhile to you, then. Johnny took a moment to glance around the room. Comfortable, certainly, but hardly up to the standards of luxury he would have expected in a Dominion Comité's personal quarters. Obviously, it's not the wealth, either. So what is it? The power to make people do what you want? Darl shook his head. You miss the whole point of what happened here. Do I? You knew the Gantuas would be going on a rampage just at the time you came dangling your Cobra bait in front of our faces. You knew all along it was the dehydrated Blussa reeds, yet you said nothing about it until I forced your hand. And what if I had? Darl countered. It's not as if I could be blamed for causing the situation. Johnny snorted. Of course not. But as you said outside, Darl continued as if he hadn't noticed the interruption, the important question is why? Why did I offer, and why did Aventine accept? Why the Council accepted is easy, Johnny said. You're a Dominion Comité, and what you say goes. Darl shook his head. I told you you were missing the point. The Gantua problem helped, certainly, but it was really only part of a much more basic motivation. They accepted because it was the solution that required the least amount of work. Johnny frowned. I don't understand. It's clear enough. By placing the main burden and danger of Aventine's growth on you Cobras, they've postponed any need to shift the responsibility to the general population. Given a chance to continue such a system, people will nearly always jump at it, especially with an excuse as immediate and convenient as the Gantuas to point to. But it's only a short-term solution, Johnny insisted. In the long run, I know that, Darl snapped. But the fraction of humanity who can sacrifice their next meal for a feast 2 weeks away wouldn't fill this city. If you're going to stay in politics, you'd damn well better learn that. He stopped and grimaced into the silence. It's been years since I lost my temper in anything approaching public, he admitted. Forgive me and take it as a sign that I'm not any happier than you are that this had to be done. Why did it? Johnny asked quietly. 2 weeks ago he would have shouted the question, putting into it all the frustration and fury he'd felt then. But now the anger was gone, and he'd accepted his failure, and the question was a simple request for information. Darl sighed. The other why? Because, Syndic Moreau, it was the only way I could think of to save this world from disaster. He waved his hand skyward. The troughed threats to close the corridor have been getting louder and more insistent over the past year or so. Only one thing keeps them from doing it tonight, the fact that it would mean a two-front war. And for Aventine to be a credible part of that two-front threat, you must have a continued Cobra presence. Johnny shook his head. But it doesn't work that way. We have no transport capability to speak of. We can't possibly threaten them. And even if we could, they could always launch a preemptive strike and wipe us out from the sky in a matter of hours. But they wouldn't. I once thought that myself. But the more I study the indirect psychological data gleaned over the years, the more I suspect mass destruction simply isn't the troughed way of making war. No, they'd be much more likely to invade, as they did on Silvern and Adirondack. But you still don't need Cobras to defend against that, Johnny persisted, feeling frustration stirring to life in him again. You brought in anti-armor lasers. You could just as easily have brought in standard laser rifles and organized a militia or even a standing army. Why can't I make you understand that? Darl smiled sadly. Because the Troughts aren't afraid of human militias or armies. They're afraid of Cobras. Johnny blinked. He opened his mouth to disagree, but all that came out was a single whispered syllable. Damn. Darl nodded. And you see now why I had to do all this. Aventine may never have the ability to truly defend itself against an invasion, but as long as a deterrent exists, even a purely psychological one, well, you at least have a chance. And the Dominion is spared the trouble and expense of a punitive war, Johnny suggested acidly. Again Darl smiled. You're beginning to understand the mechanisms of politics. The greatest good for the greatest number, and immediate benefits for as many as possible. Or at least for those whose support you need, Johnny asked quietly. Those whose objections don't count can be ignored. Johnny, it's your safety we're talking about here, Jamie put in earnestly. Yes, it's going to cost you something, but everything in life does. I know that. Johnny stood up. And I'll even accept that the comité had our interests at least somewhat at heart. But I don't have to like his solution, and I don't have to like his method of pushing it on us. You withheld information about the Gantuas from us, comité, maybe for months, and someone could have been killed because of it. If I could see it make a scrap of difference, I'd have that fact on the public net tonight. As it is, I suppose I'll just have to leave you to your own conscience, if you still have one. Johnny, Jamie began angrily. No, it's all right, Darl interrupted him. An honest enemy is worth a dozen allies of expediency. Goodbye, Syndic Moreau. Johnny nodded and turned his back on the comité. The door slid open as he approached it, and he stepped through, relying on his memory to get him back through the corridors to the ship's exit. Thoughts churning, he didn't notice Jamie had followed him until the other spoke. I'm sorry it had to end that way. I would have liked you to understand him. Oh, I understand him, Johnny replied shortly. I understand that he's a politician and can't bother to think through the human consequences of his chess moves. You're a politician now yourself, Jamie reminded him, guiding him through a turn he'd forgotten. Chances are you'll be stuck with a similar no-win situation yourself someday. In the meantime, I hope you have enough wins and losses to be able to handle both a little better. They said their goodbyes at the entryway. Cool, formal words of farewell Johnny would never have envisioned saying to his own brother. And a few minutes later, the Cobra was back in his car. But he didn't drive off immediately. Instead, he sat behind the wheel and stared at the muted sheen of the Dominion ship, his mind replaying over and over again Jamie's last words to him. Could he really be reacting so strongly simply because he'd lost a minor power struggle? He was unused to defeat, after all. Could his noble-sounding concern for Aventine's future be truly that petty underneath? No. He'd suffered defeats many times, on Adirondack, on Horizon after the war, even in the opening round of the brief struggle against Challenor. He knew how losing felt, knew how he reacted to it, and knew it was often only temporary. Temporary. With one final glance at Darl's ship, Johnny started the car. No, it wasn't over yet. Aventine would survive and grow, and he, not Darl, would be best in position to guide that growth. And if learning the art of politics was what he needed to do, he would become the best damn politician this side of Asgard. In the meantime, there were a woman, a child, and a district who deserved his full attention. Turning the car around, he headed for home. Chris, he knew, would be waiting up. Interlude. The haiku garden had changed over the years. Slowly and subtly enough, that Darl no longer remembered exactly how it had been when he had succeeded Comité Horm. One stretch, however, showed Darl's hand clearly. A series of blussa reeds, stunted cyprine trees, and other flora from Aventine. As far as he knew, he was the only comité to incorporate plant life of the outer colonies in his haiku garden, and it looked very much like no one else would ever have the chance to do so. Jamie Moreau at his side correctly interpreted his gaze. This time they mean it, don't they? He said. It was more a statement than a question. Darl hesitated, then nodded. I can't see any other interpretation for such a clear-cut demand. We're going to be lucky if the ship we're sending doesn't get stranded on Aventine. Or halfway back. Jamie squatted down to straighten the blussa reed that was trying to fall over. Halfway back would be a problem, Darl agreed. But we can't let the Troughts close the corridor without at least giving Aventine a little warning. For all the good it'll do. Jamie's voice was controlled, but Darl knew what he was thinking. The younger man's brother and sister were out there, and if the relationships were a bit cooler than they'd once been, Jamie still cared deeply for them both. They'll survive, the comité told him, wishing the words could be more than ineffectual puffs of air. The Troft concept of hostage seems to involve land and property instead of people. If they behave themselves, the Trofts aren't likely to hurt them. Jamie straightened up, brushing bits of dirt from his fingers. "Except that they won't behave themselves," he said quietly. "They'll fight, especially Johnny and the other Cobras. And that is, after all, just what the Committee and Joint Command want them to do." Darl sighed. "That's always been the fate hanging over their heads, Moreau. We knew it when we sent them out. You probably knew it deep down when you first came up with the plan. Whatever happens now, it was still worth the risk." Jamie nodded. "I know, sir, but I can't help wishing there was something we could do for them here." "I'm open to suggestions. How about letting the Trofts close the corridor in exchange for leaving the colonies alone?" Darl shook his head. "I've thought of that, but the Committee would never go for it. Impossible to verify, for starters. Besides which, we've put a lot of money, people, and effort into those worlds, and we couldn't simply cut them adrift without a fight." Jamie sighed and nodded in reluctant agreement. "I'd like to request a place on the courier ship, sir, if you can get me aboard. I know it's short notice, but I can be ready before the scheduled lift from Adirondack." Darl had suspected the request was coming, but that didn't make his answer any easier to give. "I'm sorry, Moreau, but I'm afraid I can't allow you to go. You've pointed out yourself the danger of Troft capture or destruction on the return trip, and before you tell me you're willing to take the risks, let me say I'm not willing for you to do so. You know too much about the internal workings and frictions of the Committee, and I'd hate to have the Trofts using our own most petty politics against us." "Then let me take a fast recall blockage treatment," Jamie persisted. "It wouldn't delay the lift by more than a day if I can schedule my recuperation period to be aboard ship." Darl shook his head. "No, because you could lose it all permanently with a hasty treatment like that, and I'm not risking that either." Jamie exhaled in defeat. "Yes, sir." Darl gazed off across the haiku garden. "I'm not insensitive to your feelings," he said quietly, "but such a hurried meeting with your family under these conditions would be bittersweet at best and certainly unproductive. The best thing you can do for them is to stay here and help me hold off the diplomatic breakdown as long as I can. The longer we have before actual hostilities begin, the more time they'll have to prepare. And the more time," he didn't add, "the Dominion would have to prepare its own defenses. Because, important as they were, the outer colonies represented less than 400,000 people, and from the perspective of the Dome, the Dominion's 70 other worlds and 100 billion other people were vastly more important. In the defense of those people, Aventine and its sister worlds were ultimately expendable. The greatest good for the greatest number was still the most stable guide point Darl knew. He was careful not to spell it all out for Jamie, but then the other had probably already figured it out. Why else would he have wanted to go to Aventine and say goodbye? With a sigh, Darl continued down the path. One more curve and he would be back to his office door, back to the real world and to the looming specter of war, and to waiting for a miracle he knew wouldn't happen. Statesman, 2432. The bedside phone signal was a loud directional buzz scientifically designed to wake even deep sleepers. But it had been months since Johnny slept merely deeply, and his mind barely noticed the sound enough to incorporate it into his current dream. It wasn't until Chris's gentle prodding escalated to a vigorous shake that he finally drifted up to partial wakefulness. He asked, eyes still closed. "Johnny, Theron U2's on the phone," she said. "He says it's urgent." Ugh. Johnny sighed, rolling heavily onto his side and punching at the hold-release button. "Yeah? Governor, I'm at the Starfield," U2's voice came. "A Dominion courier ship's on its way in ETA about an hour. They want you, Governor General Stigor, and as many syndics as possible assembled here when they arrive. At, 3 in the morning? What's the rush?" "I don't know, sir. They wouldn't say anything more than that. But the Starfield night manager said they wanted no more than a 12-hour turnaround." "They want to leave in 12 hours? What the hell is... Oh, never mind. I'm sure they wouldn't tell you. Johnny inhaled deeply, trying to clear the ground clutter from his brain. Have you gotten in touch with Stigger yet? No, sir. The HAP-3 satellite's still out, and it'll be another half-hour before HAP-2 is in position to make the call. And once he was notified, it would be another 3 hours before he could get back from the outland district he was touring. Which meant the whole burden of greeting this mysterious and apparently impatient Dominion representative was going to fall on Johnny. Well, you'd better get some people calling all the syndics. Even the ones who can't get here in an hour should come as soon as they can. Any idea of what rank this guy is? No, sir. But from his attitude, I doubt he's looking for much in the way of ceremony. Well, that's one bright spot anyway. If it's efficiency he wants, we'll give it to him with spangles. We'll skip the Dominion building altogether and meet at the Starfield's entry point building. Can you get us a decently sized office or conference room and set up some security around it? Almo Pyre's already down there. I'll have him find you a room. Good. Johnny tried to think of anything else he should suggest, but gave up the effort. You two generally knew what he was doing anyway. All right, I'll be at the Starfield in half an hour. Better get out there yourself. I might need you. Yes, sir. Sorry about all this. It's okay. See you. Johnny flicked off the phone with a sigh and lay quietly for a moment, gathering his strength. Then, trying not to groan audibly, he sat up. It wasn't as bad as he'd expected. He felt the usual stiffness in his joints, but only 1 or 2 actual twinges of pain. The lightheadedness left quickly, and he got to his feet. The hemophaciant pills were on his nightstand, but he technically wasn't supposed to take one for another 4 hours. He did so anyway, and by the time he finished his shower, the last remnants of his anemic fatigue were gone, at least for a while. Chris had been busy in his brief absence, finding and laying out his best formal wear. "What do you think it's all about?" she asked, keeping her voice low. The 8-year-olds, Joshua and Justin, were in the next room, and both had a history of light sleeping. Johnny shook his head. The last time they sent someone without at least a couple months' warning, it was to stick us with the Cobra factory. I suppose it could be something like that, but a 12-hour turnaround sounds awfully ominous. He either wants to get back home as fast as possible or doesn't want to spend any more time here than absolutely necessary. "Could some disease have shown up in our last shipment?" Chris asked, holding his shirt for him. "A lot of those commercial carriers only take minimal precautions." If it had, they'd probably have specified that they'd stay aboard their ship while it was being serviced. Johnny grimaced as he backed into the sleeves, trying to keep the sudden pain from showing. Chris noticed anyway. "Dad called this afternoon to remind you again about getting that checkup," she said. "What for?" Johnny growled. "To hear him tell me my anemia and arthritis are still getting worse? I already know that." He sighed. "I'm sorry, Chris. I know I should go see Oren, but I truly don't know what good it would do. I'm paying the price for being a Superman all these years, and that's all there is to it." She was silent for a long moment, and in a way her surface calm was more disturbing than the periodic outbursts of bitterness and rage that had occurred over the first months of his condition. It meant she'd accepted the fact that he couldn't be cured and was sublimating her own pain to help him and their 3 sons handle theirs. "You'll call when you know what's going on?" she asked at last. "Sure," he promised, relieved at the change of subject. But only for a moment, because there was only one reason he could think of for the behavior of that ship out there. And if he was right, progressive anemia was likely to be the least of his worries. 5 minutes later, he was driving toward the Starfield. Beyond the glow of the street lights in the darkened city, the ghosts of Adirondack seemed to be gathering.
That was another installment in Timothy Zahn's Cobra, and that's it for the podcast. Thanks as always to Audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Praise, thanks, and gratitude to Larry Correia, and be sure to tune in next week for part 2 of our discussion. Good night, Tony Daniel, wherever you are. This is David Afsharirad coming to you from a soundproof bunker somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Join us here next week at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.